For nearly a century, the kingdom of Eldoria had known peace. Its enormous stone walls stretched across the mountains, protecting millions of people from the wild lands beyond. At the center of the kingdom stood the capital, Valadorn, where the royal palace rose above the city like a black mountain. For 20 years, King Arvin had ruled Eldoria. He was respected by his people and feared by his enemies. Old soldiers called him the greatest king in their history because, decades earlier, he had defeated the mysterious Ashborn tribes of the north. But on the night of Eldoria's 100th Festival of Crowns, something changed. Thousands gathered beneath golden banners while musicians filled the streets. Nobles drank wine on balconies, children carried lanterns, and soldiers stood proudly along the palace walls. King Arvin appeared before the crowd. Everyone cheered, but the king did not smile. His eyes remained fixed on the northern mountains. Beside him stood his 24-year-old son, Prince Kale. "Father," Kale whispered, "why are you looking north?" Arvin finally turned. "Do you hear it?" Kale listened. "Nothing. Only music and cheering." "I hear nothing." Arvin's face became pale. "Exactly." Before Kale could ask another question, the king suddenly grabbed his arm. "If anything happens to me tonight, never trust the council." "Why?" "Because they already know." "Know what?" Arvin looked toward the palace doors. "I was wrong 20 years ago." Then he walked away. Hours later, the festival ended. Arvin returned to his private chamber. He dismissed his guards and locked the doors. For several minutes, everything remained silent. Then the candles went out. Arvin slowly reached for his sword. "Come out." A figure emerged from the darkness. The king recognized the assassin immediately. Not by his face, by his eyes. "You." The assassin raised a blade. Arvin barely managed to defend himself. Steel struck steel. The room erupted into chaos. The king fought desperately, but the assassin was faster. A blade pierced Arvin's side. He collapsed beside the throne. The assassin stood over him. "Forgive me." Arvin looked up. "Tell my son." His voice weakened. "Don't open the gate." Then the assassin disappeared. By sunrise, the king was declared dead. The kingdom mourned. Kale stood before his father's body, unable to believe what had happened. But as the funeral bells rang across Eldoria, nobody noticed something strange. The king's body had disappeared. And beneath the palace, someone was still alive. The funeral of King Arvin lasted 3 days. Every street in Valadorn was covered with black banners. Citizens gathered outside the palace carrying candles. Soldiers stood silently beside the royal tomb. Nobles whispered about succession, war, and the possibility of rebellion. But nobody mourned more deeply than Prince Kale. At 24, he had suddenly become king. He had spent his entire life preparing for war, diplomacy, and leadership. He had never prepared to bury his father. On the 4th morning, Kale entered the throne room. The royal council waited for him. Lord Varric, the oldest member, stepped forward. "Your Majesty." Kale looked at the throne. It had belonged to his father for 20 years. "I don't want it." Varric lowered his head. "The kingdom needs you." Kale walked toward the throne. He noticed something unusual. A small streak of blood remained on the armrest. His father's blood. He touched it. Then a messenger burst through the doors. "My king." Everyone turned. "What happened?" "The northern fortress of Draxon has fallen." Silence filled the room. Kale stared at him. "Who attacked it?" The messenger struggled to breathe. "We don't know." "How many enemies?" "We didn't see an army." "Then how did the fortress fall?" The messenger's face became pale. "Something came from the mountains." The council immediately dismissed his words as panic. But Kale ordered soldiers to investigate. That evening, another messenger arrived. This time, he carried a piece of black armor. Kale recognized it from old paintings. The Ashborn, the ancient northern warriors supposedly destroyed by King Arvin. Kale's father had always told him the Ashborn were extinct. But now their armor had appeared at the border. That night, Kale entered his father's private study. The room smelled of dust and smoke. He searched through documents until he found a locked wooden chest. Inside were maps, hundreds of them. Kale unfolded the first. It showed Eldoria. The second showed Eldoria burning. The third showed the capital surrounded by strange symbols. Then he discovered something terrifying. Each map carried a date. Some were from decades ago. Others were dated in the future. Kale's hands began shaking. The newest map was dated 3 days from now. It showed Valadorn destroyed. Across the bottom, his father's handwriting read, "When my son becomes king, The truth will return. Kale looked toward the throne room. For the first time, he wondered whether his father's death had been part of something much larger. Then he heard a sound. Knock, knock, knock. It came from beneath the floor. Kale froze. The knocking continued. Something beneath the palace was trying to get out. Kale spent the entire night searching his father's study. The knocking continued. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 knocks. Silence. It seemed deliberate. Finally, Kale discovered a hidden mechanism beneath the royal desk. He pressed a small iron symbol. The floor moved. A staircase appeared. Cold air rose from below. Kale took a lantern and descended. The staircase seemed endless. Ancient symbols covered the walls. Some resembled the markings found on Ashbourne armor. At the bottom stood an enormous stone door. Carved into it were the words, "Only the blood of the king may enter." Kale placed his hand against the door. It opened. Beyond it was a massive underground corridor. The walls were covered with paintings. They showed humans fighting the Ashbourne. But something about the paintings disturbed Kale. The Ashbourne were not attacking. They were running. Behind them stood an enormous creature. Kale continued deeper. Eventually he reached a prison. A single chamber stood in the center. Inside was a man sitting against the wall. His hair was silver. His face was covered in wounds. Kale raised his sword. "Who are you?" The prisoner slowly looked up. Kale's lantern nearly fell from his hand. The man's face was older, thinner, and wounded. But there was no mistaking him. It was his father, King Arvin, alive. Kale couldn't speak. Arvin smiled weakly. "You finally found me." Kale stepped backward. "You're dead. I know. You were murdered. I allowed them to believe that." Kale's anger exploded. "You allowed me to bury an empty coffin?" Arvin lowered his eyes. "I had no choice. You always had a choice." Kale struck the prison bars. "Why?" Arvin looked toward the darkness behind him. "Because something beneath this kingdom is waking." Kale stared at him. "The Ashbourne?" "No." "Then what?" Arvin's voice became barely audible. "The reason the Ashbourne fled." Suddenly the ground shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Arvin grabbed the bars. "You must leave." "What is happening?" "The prison is weakening." Kale looked around. "What prison?" Arvin stared directly at him. "The entire kingdom." Kale couldn't understand. Then Arvin explained the secret hidden for generations. Eldoria had not been built to defend humanity from the northern lands. It had been built to contain something beneath the earth. Something ancient. Something that could not be killed. For centuries, every king had protected the secret. Arvin had spent 20 years maintaining the prison. Now his strength was disappearing. And the thing below was beginning to wake. Kale refused to leave his father. For the first time in his life, he demanded the truth. Arvin explained everything. 20 years earlier, he had discovered ancient records beneath the northern mountains. The records described an enormous creature called the Hollow King. It had existed before Eldoria, before the Ashbourne, and perhaps before humanity itself. It did not conquer kingdoms. It consumed them. Entire civilizations had disappeared because of it. The Ashbourne had once fought it. They failed, so they fled south. Humans found them and assumed they were invading. A war began. King Arvin eventually discovered the truth and ended the conflict. But the royal council refused to reveal what they had learned. They feared panic. Instead, they created a false history. The Ashbourne became monsters. Eldoria became the heroic kingdom that defeated them. And the real enemy remained hidden beneath the capital. Kale couldn't believe it. "Then why are the Ashbourne returning?" Arvin answered. "They aren't returning." A tremendous roar shook the underground chamber. "They are running." The next morning, Kale ordered the northern army to advance toward the mountains. Thousands of soldiers marched through snow-covered valleys. Kale rode at the front. When they reached Draxon Fortress, they found no enemy army. The fortress was empty. No bodies, no weapons, no survivors. But thousands of footprints surrounded the walls. They belonged to the Ashbourne. Kale followed them north. Eventually the soldiers reached a massive valley. There, they saw something impossible. Thousands of Ashbourne were fleeing south. Men, women, children. They carried wounded relatives and ancient belongings. They weren't soldiers. They were refugees. An elderly Ashbourne woman approached Kale. His soldiers immediately raised their weapons. Kale ordered them to lower their swords. "Why are you running?" The woman stared at him. "Because your father knew." Kale froze. "You knew my father?" "He was the only human who believed us." "What are you running from?" The woman turned toward the mountains. Dark clouds gathered above them. Then the mountains began shaking. A distant sound rolled across the valley. Not a roar, a heartbeat. Boom, boom, boom. The soldiers looked at each other. The ash-born woman whispered, "It has awakened." Kale looked toward the horizon. A black shape moved behind the mountains. It was so enormous that the clouds seemed to move around its body. Kale finally understood. The Ashborn had never been the enemy. They had been warning humanity. And now the warning was over. Kale returned to Valadorn with the Ashborn refugees. The citizens panicked. They had been taught for generations that the Ashborn were monsters. When thousands appeared outside the capital, people screamed and demanded their destruction. The council ordered Kale to attack. Kale refused. Lord Varric confronted him. "Your Majesty, you are allowing our greatest enemies into the capital." Kale looked directly at him. "They were never our enemies." Varric's expression changed. "What did your father tell you?" Kale realized immediately. The council already knew. They had known for decades. That night, Kale brought the council beneath the palace. Arven was still imprisoned there. The old king looked at the council. "You kept the lie alive." Varric responded coldly. "We protected the kingdom. You protected your throne." Varric looked at Kale. "Your father wanted to destroy everything." Kale stepped forward. "Everything?" "The prison." Silence. Varric explained that the royal palace itself had been constructed over the creature's prison. The throne was part of the mechanism. Every king sat upon it because royal blood maintained the seal. That was why Arven had disappeared. He had deliberately removed himself from the throne to prevent the council from sacrificing him publicly. But now Kale had become king. The seal had transferred to him. Kale suddenly felt pain in his chest. A dark symbol appeared beneath his skin. Arven looked terrified. "It has chosen you." Kale fell to his knees. The ground shook. Above them, people screamed. A crack appeared across the palace floor. Then another. And another. The enormous towers of Valadorn began moving. Stone groaned. Buildings bent. The palace walls shifted like living bones. Kale looked upward. The city itself was shaking. Then the throne room collapsed. The royal throne fell through the floor. A massive hole opened beneath it. From the darkness came a deep breathing sound. Everyone froze. Then two enormous eyes opened below the capital. The Hollow King was awake. Arven looked at his son. "You have one choice." Kale raised his head. "What choice?" "Become its prison." Kale stared into the darkness. "And if I refuse?" Arven looked toward the collapsing city. Then Eldoria dies. Valadorn erupted into chaos. Citizens ran through burning streets. Buildings collapsed. Stone towers split apart. The royal palace disappeared into the earth. The Hollow King rose beneath the city. Its body was so enormous that only parts of it could be seen through smoke and falling stone. Soldiers attacked. Their arrows disappeared against its armor. Catapults fired enormous rocks. The creature barely reacted. Kale watched from the palace ruins. His father stood beside him. "Take the throne," Arven said. "If I do, I become its prison." "Yes. Forever?" Arven nodded. Kale looked at the city. Thousands were trapped. Children cried in the streets. Soldiers fought hopelessly. Kale closed his eyes. Then he removed his crown. "No." Arven looked at him. "What are you doing?" "I'm ending this." Kale ordered every surviving soldier to evacuate the capital. The Ashborn joined them. For the first time, humans and Ashborn fought side by side. They carried civilians through burning streets. They lifted fallen stones. They formed defensive lines around the fleeing population. But the creature continued advancing. Arven remained behind. Kale grabbed his arm. "Come with us." Arven shook his head. "My time is over. You already died once. I died 20 years ago." Kale's eyes filled with anger. "You don't get to abandon me again." Arven smiled. "You were always stronger than I was." Then he placed his hand on Kale's shoulder. "Your kingdom doesn't need another king." He looked toward the burning palace. "It needs someone willing to destroy the throne." Arven turned away. Kale understood. "No." Arven walked into the ruins. "Father." Arven stopped. Without turning around, he said, "Remember this." Kale waited. "A king is not the man who sits above everyone." Arven looked back. "A king is the man who stands between them and the darkness." Then Arven entered the palace. The creature reached the throne room. A tremendous roar shook the city. A blinding explosion followed. The palace collapsed. Kale screamed his father's name. But there was no answer. Only silence. The survivors escaped beyond the city walls. Kale looked back. Valadorn was burning. The kingdom he had inherited no longer existed. But the Hollow King was still alive. And it was moving north, toward the people who had escaped. Kale picked up his sword. The war had begun. For 3 days, the survivors traveled north. Thousands of humans followed Kale. Thousands of Ashborn followed behind them. Nobody trusted each other. But they had one common enemy. The Hollow King. Kale eventually stopped the army beside an abandoned fortress. He climbed the highest tower. Below him stood soldiers, refugees, and families. They were exhausted, terrified, hungry. Kale looked at the Ashborn leader. Her name was Sarah. You fought the creature before. Yes. How did you stop it? We didn't. Kale frowned. What? We only survived. Sarah explained that ancient Ashborn records contained one possible weakness. The Hollow King could not be killed by weapons. It could only be destroyed by breaking the bond between its physical body and the ancient power beneath the earth. To do that, someone had to enter its heart. Kale immediately volunteered. Sarah refused. You won't survive. Kale looked at her. My father didn't either. She understood. Meanwhile, the council survivors attempted to seize control. Lord Varric claimed Kale had failed. We need a new king. Kale drew his sword. No. Varric stared. You are refusing your own crown? Kale removed the broken crown from his cloak. I already lost it. He placed it on the ground. I won't rebuild the kingdom that created this. Then he turned toward the Ashborn. For centuries we were taught to hate each other. Nobody spoke. We were told they were monsters. He looked at the humans. They were told we were monsters. Kale raised his sword. But we were all afraid of the same thing. The soldiers slowly began raising their weapons. Human soldiers, Ashborn warriors, northern clans, former enemies, one army. Kale announced the plan. They would lure the Hollow King into the northern valley. The army would hold its body in place. Kale would enter its heart. Sarah would lead the Ashborn. The human soldiers would protect the civilians. It was their only chance. That night, Kale sat alone beside a fire. A young Ashborn boy approached. Are you really a king? Kale smiled sadly. Not anymore. The boy looked confused. Then why are you fighting? Kale looked toward the burning horizon. Because someone has to. The next morning, the army marched. Behind them lay everything they had lost. Ahead waited the largest creature any living human had ever seen. The army reached the northern valley before sunrise. The Hollow King arrived shortly afterward. The mountains trembled beneath its footsteps. Its enormous body emerged from the fog. Human soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder with Ashborn warriors. Nobody moved. Then Kale raised his sword. The horns sounded. The battle began. Thousands charged. Arrows filled the sky. Ashborn warriors attacked the creature's legs while human soldiers launched massive chains around its limbs. The Hollow King roared. The sound knocked soldiers from their feet. Kale ran directly toward it. Sarah followed. Kale, he turned. Stay with the army. You'll need me. Before he could answer, the creature struck. The ground exploded. Kale was thrown into a mountain wall. His sword shattered. Sarah pulled him from the rubble. Are you alive? Kale coughed. Unfortunately. She smiled. Then the creature opened its chest. A massive black opening appeared. Inside was a glowing red light. Kale understood. That's the heart. Sarah grabbed his arm. Then we go together. They climbed the creature's body. The surface moved beneath their feet like living armor. Wind screamed around them. The army below continued fighting. Thousands of soldiers were falling. But they held the creature back. Kale and Sarah reached the opening. Inside was a vast chamber. The walls pulsed like veins. At the center floated a massive sphere of black energy. Kale approached. A voice entered his mind. You carry the blood of the kings, asterisk. Kale stopped. Who are you? I am what your ancestors feared, asterisk. Images appeared. Ancient cities. Dead civilizations. Kings kneeling before the creature. Then Kale saw something unexpected. His father, Arvin, had entered this place 20 years earlier. He had not been imprisoned by the creature. He had voluntarily bound himself to it. Arvin's sacrifice had slowed it. Kale finally understood why his father had survived so long. He had been fighting the creature from inside. A final memory appeared. Arvin looked directly at Kale. If you are seeing this, I failed. Kale's eyes filled with tears. The voice returned. Take your father's place, asterisk. Kale looked at the black energy. If he accepted, the creature would sleep. Millions would survive, but he would remain trapped forever. Sarah looked at him. You don't have to. Kale remembered his father's final words. A king stands between his people and darkness. Kale stepped forward. Then he reached for the heart. The moment Kale touched the creature's heart, the entire world seemed to stop. The battlefield disappeared. The mountains vanished. Kale found himself standing in darkness. Across from him stood his father. Arvin looked exactly as Kale remembered him before the war. Young, strong, alive. Kale stepped forward. Father. Arvin smiled. You finally came. I don't know what to do. You already know. Kale looked behind him. The darkness contained countless images. Every king of Eldoria, every sacrifice, every generation that had maintained the prison. Kale understood the truth. The creature wasn't simply a monster. It was connected to the fear and violence of the kingdom itself. The throne had been powered by sacrifice. The kingdom had survived by feeding its fear. As long as people believed they needed a king to protect them, the creature would remain powerful. Kale turned toward Arvin. So I destroy the throne. Arvin nodded. But the throne is gone. Kale looked confused. Then he realized. The throne was no longer a physical object. It existed inside him. The royal blood itself was the final prison. Kale had to destroy his own connection to it. He pulled his sword from his belt. The blade was broken, but it was enough. Kale pressed it against his chest. Arvin looked worried. You may not survive. Kale smiled. Neither did you. He drove the broken blade into the symbol of the royal bloodline. A massive explosion of light erupted. The creature screamed. Across the battlefield, its body began collapsing. Soldiers ran. Mountains shook. The black clouds above the valley split apart. The Hollow King fell. Kale disappeared inside the explosion. Sarah screamed his name. Then silence. The creature was gone. The battlefield became still. The soldiers looked toward the ruined valley. No king appeared. No crown. No army commander. Only a broken sword lying in the snow. Sarah walked toward it. She picked it up. Then something moved beneath the rubble. Kale emerged. His armor was destroyed. His face was covered in blood. But he was alive. Sarah stared at him. You're alive. Kale looked at his hands. The royal symbol had disappeared. He looked toward the horizon. The kingdom was free. But there was no throne anymore. No royal bloodline. No ancient prison. No king. Kale picked up the broken crown. For a moment, he held it. Then he threw it into the fire. The survivors watched. Eldoria had ended. Something new would have to begin. 6 months later, the ruins of Valadorn were almost unrecognizable. The palace was gone. The royal throne had been destroyed. The enormous walls had collapsed. But the city was slowly being rebuilt. Humans and Ashbourne worked together. Stone by stone, street by street. There were no royal banners. No noble houses. No throne. Instead, representatives from every surviving community gathered in a new council. Kale refused to lead it. He lived in a small house near the city's eastern gate. One morning, a former soldier found him repairing a broken bridge. Your Majesty. Kale looked up. I'm not your king. The soldier smiled. You'll always be the king who saved us. Kale shook his head. No. He looked across the city. Thousands saved thousands. The soldier remained silent. Kale returned to repairing the bridge. Years passed. The story of the Hollow King became legend. Children learned about the ancient war. They learned that the Ashbourne had never been monsters. They learned that their ancestors had lied. And they learned about the young king who destroyed his own throne. But there was one part of the story nobody understood. What happened to the creature's heart? Some believed it had been destroyed. Others believed it had returned beneath the mountains. Kale never answered. Because sometimes, during the coldest nights, he could still hear something. A heartbeat. Boom, boom, boom. One evening, Kale stood alone on a mountain overlooking the rebuilt city. Sarah joined him. You hear it too, she said. Kale nodded. The creature? No. He looked toward the distant mountains. Something else. The ground trembled. Very slightly. Sarah reached for her weapon. Kale stopped her. Wait. A crack appeared across the mountain. Deep beneath the earth, something ancient moved. But it wasn't the Hollow King. A second set of enormous eyes opened. Then another. And another. Kale stared into the darkness. He finally understood what his father had discovered 20 years earlier. The Hollow King had never been the only creature. It had been guarding the world from something even worse. Kale turned toward the city. Thousands of people lived peacefully below. He had destroyed the throne. He had ended the old kingdom. But now a new threat was awakening. Sarah asked, "What do we do?" Kale looked at the rising sun. He smiled. "We build an army." "Against what?" Kale drew his new sword. "Everything that's coming." The camera rises above the mountains. Far below, beneath the earth, countless enormous eyes open. Then the screen fades to black. The end. Or the beginning.